So I've wanted to read Brian Michael Bendis' run on Daredevil for a long time and haven't had the opportunity up until now when I picked up Volume 1 of the Ultimate Collection of his run on Daredevil, The Man Without Fear. This is the run that he did for quite a while with Alex Maleev doing the artwork. Now this was actually published in a Marvel omnibus, which are the giant oversized hardcovers which usually collect about 1,000 pages worth of comics. It was actually split over two Marvel omnibuses, and I missed out on getting them when they were in print, and now those omnibuses go for anywhere over £300. So hopefully at some point in the future Marvel will reprint them, but that's besides the point. So this actually, this book here is only volume 1 of 3 in quite big paperbacks, and this collects issues 16 to 19 and 26 to 40 of Brian Michael Bendis' Daredevil run. Now the first 4 issues are actually a sort of mini arc to start off his run called Wake Up, which is actually not drawn by Alex Maleev. It's sort of painted artwork, and that's by a guy called David Mack. It has a very sort of Sandman vibe to it. As you can see, and what I think is quite clever, at the beginning of the first issue, you've got your sort of generic looking comic book artwork, and then as the issue progresses it turns to be slightly more surreal and cartoon-like, until eventually the run sort of settles into its painted artwork, which is gorgeous. It's beautiful. There's no two ways about it. It has, like I say, a very Sandman vibe to it, artwork reminiscent of Neil Gaiman's Vertigo comic. Now, I've heard a few criticisms of having this run start with that mini arc, because it is almost completely separate to what happens afterwards. After the story Wake Up, we then sort of launch into Brian Michael Bendis' huge overarching story that so far has progressed through volume 1 and into volume 2, which I'm reading at the moment. But Wake Up I really enjoyed, and I thought it was quite an interesting way to start the run, and it essentially tells the story of a catatonic young boy who, it turns out, is his father is one of Daredevil's rogues gallery, and they do make reference to Daredevil having a pretty terrible and camp rogues gallery of villains, and I thought that was very interesting. Like, what would the effect be on a child of one of these sort of lesser known villains? I won't go into the specifics of it because, I don't want to spoil any sort of major story revelations, and for the rest of this review, I won't be spoiling anything major. You might get the minor sort of spoilers, but that's going to be unavoidable. So Wake Up I really enjoyed. I thought it was quite a different take, especially with the artwork on the character of Daredevil. We then launch into the main sort of meat and potatoes of Brian Michael Bendis' run, and that's, from that point on, it's all drawn by Alex Maleev. Now, Alex Maleev's artwork, if I can find an example for you here, is very sort of dark, almost, it feels gritty, but it's quite angular and stylised. Sort of reminds me, just hints of the artist Jock and his sort of work, but it completely suits the character of Daredevil. Now, as you can see here, here's just a quick example of his artwork, which is fantastic. And once you get into that story, you'll see that Brian Michael Bendis is basically sowing seeds that he's going to have to develop, much later on in the story. There's quite a lot in there, but the basic idea of that plot is that there's trouble within the Kingpin's ranks. A sort of coup, if you will, that has a knock-on effect to Matt Murdock, and actually builds on and develops something that Frank Miller did back in his Born Again Daredevil run. So they take something that happened in Born Again, bring it into this run and develop it a little bit, and it has an effect on Matt Murdock's life and all the rest of it, and it progresses from there. So I have to say that Born Again was probably one of my favourite Frank Miller books, and that's including, all his most sort of famous, Year One and The Dark Knight Returns. Born Again I absolutely love, and I'd be tempted to say, I've probably not read it as much as those others, but I'd be tempted to say that Born Again is my favourite Frank Miller run on comics. But I like the fact that Bendis, will take something that has been done previously and take it to its sort of natural foremost conclusion. So that was very fun. You have to commend Bendis really on his, and he's famous for it, his dialogue writing. You know, the dialogue in this book is fairly brilliant. People talk, or tend to talk, like real people do in real life, and this is something that, like I said, he's famous for, and people always commend him on his dialogue writing. And he's got a very sort of Quentin Tarantino or Kevin Smith approach to dialogue, where he'll have characters talk about just random topics that have no effect on the story. You know, it's not exposition, it's literally just, this is what these characters talk about in the spare time. And a case in point is a scene where you have two policemen sat in a car talking about how would you know, when a superhero approaches you, how would you know it's really them, because you've never seen the face. It could be somebody, you know, in like a, I don't know, a Halloween costume or something, and how do you know that it's not, that it's a real person? And they sit and talk there for a couple of pages, and I found that stuff to be really, you know, interesting, and I love that. I love the fact that there is a sort of through line of the real world in Brian Michael Bendis's book, and also the fact that he does have cameos from like Spider-Man cameos in this, probably more so than anyone else, and Peter Parker. And I believe this was the first time that Bendis wrote any Peter Parker, but I might be wrong on that. But he basically takes other Marvel characters, because we know how much Marvel likes to cross over their characters and cross-pollinate and all that, and they always have in the books, and they're now doing it in the films. But he never loses sight, and he never forgets that this is a Daredevil story. You know, fundamentally, down to its core, it's a Daredevil story. And although he'll have a cameo from Spider-Man, he'll use that cameo to, you know, better understand Matt Murdock. And without going into too much detail about what Peter Parker's doing there, I definitely feel that way about his cameo in this book. You know, I felt that it sheds a bit more light on Matt Murdock and their sort of dynamic. So I love all that. I love the fact that he doesn't let any cameos and stuff weigh the book down. It is a very sort of disciplined and streamlined run with the odd cameo here and there. But the way he writes Matt Murdock as well is quite interesting, because Daredevil's always been one of my favourite superheroes for many reasons. But I do find that the way he writes Matt Murdock in this can sometimes be a bit self-righteous. And especially when you see him in court, you know, defending, for example, defending the little person against the man or a big corporation or something like that. He can come across as being a bit self-righteous, but then when I was reading it, I was like, I love that, because I imagine that the character of Matt Murdock, who's one of the best lawyers in New York, would be that way. You know, and while whether or not Brian Michael Bendis, in making the character slightly self-righteous, wanted to alienate the audience, I found that to be a positive on the book. The fact that I was like reading some of Matt Murdock's dialogue and going, oh God, really? You know, shut up, is a testament to Bendis's writing, because it's a realistic depiction of that kind of character. So I appreciate that. You know, while I'm I don't know, I think self-righteous people just tend to get on my nerves a little bit, but I like that. I like the fact that Matt Murdock irritated me a little bit in this, because later on in the book, for different reasons, you know, you see that he's irritating his best friend, Foggy Nelson, or a fellow superhero, Luke Cage. You know, they're irritated by Matt Murdock, and it's like, I'm irritated by Matt Murdock at times in this book. So I love that. It makes you feel like you're alongside them, you know, looking at Matt going, Matt, what are you doing? So I loved all that. The book itself, I mean, there are certain revelations in this that I'm not going to give here in the video because it will ruin the run, but you can see from the sort of first volume that Brian Michael Bendis is definitely messing with the status quo. He's changing things in Daredevil, and Daredevil will probably never be the same again after this run. Like I said, after reading this, I'm only a few issues into volume 2. But so far, we are definitely seeing, you know, Brian Michael Bendis's story and ideas start to blossom, and it's definitely going to mess with the status quo of Daredevil. And I imagine a lot of people watching this may already know where it goes. I have an idea of where it's going, but like I said, I've never read it, so please don't spoil it. So far though, volume 1, brilliant. I highly recommend it. You know, if it's one of those runs that you just didn't get around to reading like me, and you missed out on the omnibus and get these paperbacks, the Ultimate Collections. It's a great run. So far, Volume 1's absolutely fantastic. I give it top marks. And I will be reviewing Volume 2 once I've read that. So thank you for watching. Please, you know, either like or subscribe and stuff and comment. Let me know what you think of this run on Daredevil, and I'll see you in the next video.